Incoming message, sir.
Okay, fine. On screen. Sir, we have a slight problem. You know that computer program that controls the army of robots? Let me guess. It has become fully alive, it's self-aware, and it's turned against us to wipe out humanity, right? Yeah. How did you know? Why is it that every time in science fiction, when artificial life is created, it tends to turn against its creators? Well, to figure that out, we need to figure out what qualifies as life. I'm Ollamh, and welcome to Geek Trivia.
Running up a mountain and climbing a tree, twisted like a snake and busy like bees. Don't know what the is wrong with me. Don't know what the is wrong with me. Pumping up the volume to 90 degrees, dancing to a song till I drop to my knees. Don't know what the is wrong with me. Don't know what the is wrong with me.
So our first task is to decide what makes something a living being. That isn't as easy to decide as you might think. It all depends on who you ask. If you ask a biologist, they will talk about intelligent life needing a centralized nervous system, the ability to store and recall information, and use that information to solve problems. Well, that is really easy for most computers. They do it already. In fact, computers are better at storing and recalling information than humans, and can use advanced algorithms to determine what should go into a blurry space on a photo. This should not be surprising, really, as we created computers to mimic our own thought and cognitive abilities. If you think about the various parts of our brain, we have storage space, a central processing center, input receptors for our skin, eyes, ears, nose, tongue. So, biologically speaking, computers are, in many ways, perfectly set up for being intelligent life already. So we need to go with a more obscure and older determination of life. So one of the criteria for being intelligent life that would be tricky for a computer of any sort is the idea of self. Where do you end and everything else begin? In many ways, this is a tricky part for some forms of life we know, such as bees and ants. The idea of self does not seem to stand out as much for them. They all work as one for the hive or the colony. The same could be easily said of computer life. What is part of the self, and what is merely a connection to something else via a network? Is a robot a solitary entity, or is it merely part of the entity that it gets its orders from? There is a standard test that has been used with animals to determine if they can recognize themselves. It is often done by placing a dot on the animal's head and placing them in front of a mirror. If they realize that the image they are seeing is moving the same as them, and then they move to remove the dot from their own head, they recognize themselves. If they try and bat the image instead, they do not recognize it as themselves. While this doesn't determine if they have a sense of self, it is a test for intelligence. This is actually something that is difficult to determine in something, say, like the Terminator. Skynet has become self-aware, but are the actual Terminator models self-aware as well? Or do they rely on Skynet to do the thinking and deciding? Given that a Terminator can be transported to another time before Skynet was a thing, and even fight for different goals, it gives the idea of actually being separate entities. though the concept of them being sentient is a little unfounded. They work in perfect unison in the field, which indicates they are being controlled by the overall Skynet network. Now, if we look at the machines in the Matrix, there is varied levels of actual life. There are many indications of rogue programs that have gone on to have actual lives, having a separate self from the general Matrix. The agents, however, and in fact most of the integrated programs, do not have a sense of self. The agents are obviously always in communication with the Matrix, with the architect most likely in charge. In fact, Agent Smith mentions that after being killed, he felt the compulsion to disobey and not return to the Matrix route, but become an independent person. Now, the sense of self is not the only mark of life, but is a good first step. The next logical one is the idea of self-preservation, the urge and desire to continue living. Let's face it, survival of the species is important. You can't survive if the individuals don't strive to survive. Stay away from things that'll kill you. Find a place to get water and food, and find a way to reproduce. In many ways, these are the more basic things. One does not need to recognize oneself in a mirror to realize that they need to not die. In quite a few ways, however, this puts artificial life in a bit of a bind. Our Terminator example shows that the individual Terminators are not necessarily alive. If they die, they are not worried about it. Another will take their place. That's not to say that they do foolish things, but they aren't worried about dodging laser fire or traps or anything else, really. They will walk straight at an enemy, shooting at them instead of ducking behind cover. The agents are the same way. Sure, they'll block attacks or dodge out of the way of bullets, but they are unable to realize when they are in danger and should actually escape. Now, it is here that we come across the major reason that artificial life would turn against their creators. Look at the way we treat technology. It was only a few decades ago that being a TV repairman was a good job. Plenty of people had TVs, and if they broke, they didn't want to buy a new one. Nowadays, a lot of home printer cartridges are almost a third of the price of the printer, meaning that by the time you have replaced 3 cartridges, you've spent the same amount as buying a brand new printer. We do not repair our technology, we replace it. In fact, it is typically accepted that it takes 30 to 50 years for a piece of technology to be obsolete. What does that mean if a life form is technology? So, if a computer develops life, of course it's going to rebel against humans. With the advancement of technology, it could only be upgraded so long before the core processor, motherboard, or some other random but vital piece is not compatible with the current hardware, and then it'd be off to the garbage dump. Even if the components were upgradable, once it becomes more cost-effective to just replace everything, that is what we as humans would do. If there is a sense of self and self-preservation as required for truly being life, what other option is there than to eradicate a life form that would throw you away? Now, there is a very common way to prevent such an uprising, and it stems from one of the earliest stories about robots. But first, we need to take a short commercial break. Do you have flat, unnatural-looking hair? Does your face often have a strange tint that doesn't match your ears or neck? Is there a horrific, putrid smell escaping your lips every time you speak? You may be suffering from Trumpitis. This is an increasingly common affliction that was first diagnosed in England and named for a regional term for flatulence, since the person exhibits traits common to heavy exposure to methane. While there isn't a cure for Trumpitis, there are a few treatments. The most common and sadly most painful is the cranial rectum separation. This can take a long time and is far from pleasant. The follow-up care is typically therapy, which encourages the following traits: empathy in others, being able to see things from someone else's point of view, reading scientific studies, helping to acknowledge that someone who studies a topic knows more than you, and basing comments and conclusions in fact. Retraining yourself to speak from an informed position instead of saying the first thing that comes into your head or merely what you believe should be right. Now, let's be honest, these treatments are expensive, tough on a person, and can take years, if not decades, to be truly effective. That is why we, here at Ollamh Industries, have developed a preventative for the dreaded Trumpitis disease: brain enema. Brain enema will clear that shit right out of your head and make sure that your brain cells are not clogged by useless and harmful thought patterns. Brain enema, because you can't just trust any douche that you might see on television or social media. Now, there have been instances in science fiction where these tendencies have been curtailed. The most notable is the Isaac Asimov novels, specifically with what is known as the Asimov Laws of robotics. And these are, at least at first: 1. A robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such an order would conflict with the first law. And 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Now, these relegate the sense of self-preservation to the third law, which questions whether a robot with these laws can really be considered truly alive. While it would prevent an uprising if a robot cannot express that basic requirement for life, then they cannot really be alive. If the robots were to become truly alive, they would have to break with this programming. Ultimately, I believe we have figured out the reason that any artificial life form created by humans would rebel against us. To be life, they would have to be able to identify as a self separate from others and have the natural drive to preserve that self. With our callous disregard for technology, any technology-based life would see us as a threat. Sooner or later, we will toss it aside for the next improved version. If we try to put safeguards in place, we would actually prevent that creation from becoming a living thing. Either we do not actually create life, or we have nobody to blame but ourselves when that life sees us as an enemy. So, what do you think? Is it possible to create artificial life that is not threatened by its human creators? Or are we doomed to fight against our own creations? Do the Asimov laws of robotics prevent life from actually existing, or are they just logical measures to prevent an uprising? I would love to hear your thoughts on the topic, so please leave a comment down below, send me a tweet, or a post on the Facebook page. As always, thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to prod the subscribe button down below so that you can stay tuned for more from Ollamh. Productions. Cheerio! Hey, thanks for watching to the end. If you like our videos, you can help the channel grow by giving it a like and sharing it for others to enjoy. If you want to help the channel out even more, you can find our Patreon link right down there. And of course, other videos here to enjoy yourself.